Today we have come here to do Hanumana's Puja. Shri Hanumana is a great character in our being. And he runs all the way from Swadhisthana to your brain. And he supplies all the necessary guidance we need in our futuristic planning or in our mental activities. He gives us guidance and protection. As you know that Germany is a place where people are very active, very right-sided, use their brain too much, and they are very machine-oriented also. It is very surprising how a deity like Shri Hanumana, who is an eternal child, because he was like a monkey, his head was that of a monkey, if not of an elephant. So he was an eternal child, and he was the one who was used to run the right side of human beings. He was told that you must control the sun to begin with. He has to control the sun, that the sun in the people, if there is too much sun, then he must try to control it and make it cooler or smoother. So he was a child after all. So as soon he was born, when he knew that he has to look after the sun, he said, why not eat it off? So he ran up the Virata's body and ate up the Surya. There he had to be told, no, you have to control him, you don't have to put him inside your stomach. Because he thought that this sun will be controlled better if he has it in his own stomach. So the beauty of his character is that he is a child. And the child-like behavior of Shri Hanumana has to control the right side. If there's a right-sided mother or a right-sided father. Normally, right-sided people don't get children, normally. They're over right-sided, then even they get children, but they're really not liked by the children because they have no time for children. They all the time are very strict with the children, they shout at them, they don't know how to handle the children. Or they are over-indulgent, because they always think that I never got this, so let me give it to the child. So these extreme type of people who are right-sided have got this Hanumana, who is nothing but a child. He is very anxious to do the work of Sri Rama. Now, Sri Rama is a character, I would say, which is full of balance. Absolutely. He is the benevolent king, which Socrates has described. So he needed somebody with him all the time to do the work or to supply him or to help him, like a secretary you can call him. And Shri Hanumana was the one who was created for this purpose. Now, Sri Rama was such a assistant. I mean, you cannot have such a word for him. You can say such a servant of Sri Rama. Even the servants, you see, don't have that much of dedication for their master. You can say like a dog or a horse, but that also doesn't have. such dedication for Sri Rama that by the time he grew up, he got now 9 siddhis, Navadha siddhis. 9 siddhis he got. These siddhis are like this, that he could become big, he could become so heavy that nobody could lift him. He could become so sukshma that nobody could see him. He could become so subtle that nobody could see him. There are 9 siddhis that he got. So a person who has got the right side too much in him, he controls him with these 9 siddhis. Now, how will he control a man who is running very fast in his life? What he does is to control his movement. He makes him in such a way that he has to put down his speed. He makes his feet very heavy. Now he can't do that much. Or he makes his hands very heavy. So the person cannot work very much with his hands. So he can give a tremendous kind of a lethargic heaviness to a person who is a very right-sided person. He has got another siddhis, which are very interesting, is that he can extend he doesn't have many weapons. He has only one gada in his hand. And he can extend his tail to any extent. And he can handle people with his tails. He does not have to use his hand. Sitting down here, he can put the tail around anywhere. If he wants, he can just make a mountain of his tail and sit on that. Like he has all these monkey tricks, as you call them, you see. And all these things he has within himself is to control a person who is extremely right-sided, to begin with. Then he can fly in the air. Just he doesn't have any wings, but he can just fly in the air. That means he can become so big that the amount of air he displaces has a much more weight than his own weight. Just the same principle Archimedes, if you know the Archimedes principle. That he becomes so big that his body starts floating in the air. Like a boat, you see, you can call it. And he can fly in the air. And by flying in the air, he can carry the message from one to another through the ether. Now the subtle of the ether that we have is under the command of Shri Hanumana. He is the one who controls, or is the lord of this ether, the subtle of the ether, or say the causal of the ether, and through it, it communicates. All the communications that you find, like we have within ourselves also ductless glands, which a pituitary is using ductless glands, is through Hanumana's movement. Because he can go into a nirakar, he can go into a formless state. Also the communications, for this communication that we have, maybe we can say that we have got a loudspeaker. But we have a television, we have got radios and all those things. Where we catch on to the ether anything is all the blessings of Hanumana and are available to people who are right-sided. Only the right-sided people discover these things of the space, which we call as a cordless telephone or a thing without we have also telegraphs and where we don't use any wires. So without any connection, through the ether, he can manage. So all the ethereal connections has been done by this great engineer, Shri Hanumana. And it is so perfect, it's so perfect, that you cannot challenge it and you cannot find faults with it. Maybe your instruments may not be all right, but as far as his ethereal work is concerned, he is perfectly there. Now the scientists discover it and think that it is in the nature, but they never think, how can it be? We say something in the ether, and how is it is received on the other hand? They just take it for granted that it is so, that we say something here or we relay something on the television and it is seen the other side. But they never even think or search out how it is done, what is the way. And this is what is the work of Shri Hanumana, who has done such a beautiful network. And through that network, all these things work out. So, even on the right side, the vibrations we get in the molecules, as you know that we get molecules like sulfur dioxide. If you have the sulfur has 2 oxygen, and the oxygen goes on pulsating like that. They are isometric, symmetric type of vibrations. You all must be knowing about it. So all these things, symmetric and isometric vibrations, are created by whom? Nobody wants to know. Nobody wants to find out. Because after all, in an atom or imagine in a molecule, that deep, who does that job? Is done by Shri Hanuman in his subtle ways. So he has another great siddhi, which we call as anima. Anima, anu means a molecule, and that means it can enter into a molecule, or renu is the atom. It can enter into molecule or into atom. Now many scientists think that they are in the modern times they discovered the molecules. It's not so, because it's already in our old scriptures description of anima is there, is of anu, renu is there. So it's already described there. Now, then wherever you see the electromagnetic forces working, it is worked through Hanumana's blessings. He is the one who creates electromagnetic forces. So now we can see that as Ganesha has got the magnetic force in him, he is the magnet. He has got the magnetic force. Then we can say the electromagnetic is the one which we call as Hanumana's force, on the material side of it. But from the matter, he goes up to the brain. So he rises from Swadhisthana up to the brain. So in the brain also, he creates the co-relationships of different sides of our brain. So how much he gives us? I mean, we can say if Ganesha gives us the wisdom, then he gives us the power to think. He protects us also, that we should not think of bad things. That is, we can say that if Ganesha gives us the wisdom, then Shri Hanumana gives us the conscience. I hope you understand the difference between the two. Wisdom is where you do not need conscience so much, because you are wise, you know what is good, what is bad. But conscience is needed in a personality where he is to be controlled. And that control comes from Shri Hanumana, which is the conscience in the human being. Now this conscience which is Shri Hanumana is the subtle form of him, which gives us, is in Sanskrit called as Sat Viveka Buddhi. Means Sat means truth, Asat means untruth, and Viveka means the discrimination, and Buddhi means the intelligence. So intelligence to discriminate between the truth and untruth is given to us by Shri Hanumana. In the Sahaja Yoga system, if we say that Ganesha is the one who gives us, he is the Adhyaksha, means he is the, I call him as the Chancellor of the university. He is the one who goes on degree to us. Now you have crossed this chakra, that chakra, that chakra. And he helps us to know that what state we are in. So the Ganesha gives us, say, Nirvichar Samadhi, which we can call it as the thoughtless awareness, and Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He gives all that, and also he gives us joy. But the understanding that this is good, this is for our benevolence, mental understanding comes to us from Shri Hanumana. And it's very important for Western people, because it has to be mental, otherwise they won't understand. If it is not mental, they cannot come into abstract. It has to be mental. And so the mental understanding of whether it is good or bad is given to us by Shri Hanumana. Without him, even if you become a saint, you will be, of course, you are a saint and you will enjoy the saintliness. But whether this saintliness is all right if you live on Himalayas, or is all right when you go across to people to give them realization, all this scanning, this Viveka Buddhi, all this scanning, all this discrimination, all this guidance, all this protection is given to us by Shri Hanumana. Germany being a country which is very, very much, I should say, an essence of right side. And because of it being such an essence of right side, it's important to get the protector of right side here worshipped. But in all that Viveka Buddhi, in that discrimination, he knows one thing, that he is absolutely subservient to Sri Rama. Now what is Sri Rama? Sri Rama is the benevolent king. He works for the benevolence. And Sri Rama himself is a formal king, like Sankocha we call it. I mean, English words are not so good to explain, but Sri Rama is the one who is, who will not push forward himself. He keeps back. He's very balanced. He's a very poised person. So the Hanumana, you see, he is the one who is always anxious to do the work of Sri Rama. Always. If Sri Rama says, all right, you go and get the, he told him, go and get the Sanjeevani, is the kind of a herb that was needed to bring Lakshmana to life. He went there and he brought the whole mountain with him. Now better have it. It's like that sort of person. You see, so he brought that's childlike behavior of his. And the discrimination in this is that if Sri Rama has asked for, whatever he asked for, I'll do it. So is a relationship of a, I would say like a guru and shishya. But even more than that the shishya is just like a subservient servant, absolutely surrendered to God. Absolutely surrendered to God. And his main theme is surrender. Now see, this surrender itself shows that all those who are right-sided people are surrendered to God, not surrendered to their bosses. Mostly all those right-sided people are very surrendered to their bosses, surrendered to their jobs, sometimes surrendered to their wives also. But they are subservient to wrong people. They have no discretion. You will always find that. They have no discretion. But if you take the help of Hanumana, then he tells you that you have to be surrendered to God Almighty and not to anybody else, or to your guru like Rama. Otherwise you are not to be surrendered to anybody else, and then you are a free bird and you have all the 9 powers within yourself. Hanumana's whole thing is to antidote your overactivity, to antidote your too much thinking, to antidote your ego. Now, how he finishes the ego of people is very sweetly shown when he burnt the whole of Lanka, is the capital of Ravana, and the way he made fun of him. Because, see, anybody who is egoistical, one must make fun of him, then he is all right. Like first he went and when Ravana saw him, he said, "Who are you?" The monkey. So he just pushed his tail towards him and tickled his nose with his tail. So he is the one who makes fun of egoistical people. Now if somebody egoistical tries to trouble you, he is the one, he'll make such fun out of him that you'll be amazed how this fellow was jumping like a Humpty Dumpty has fallen down and has broken his crown. So, see, it is the job of Hanumana to protect you from egoistical people. And also he protects the egoistical people by showing them down, like say Saddam. In the case of Saddam, I just asked Hanumana to do the job, because I know he'll do it. Now, how he has put this Saddam into different circumstances that he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to go, because supposing he says, all right, I'll have war. So the whole of Iraq will be finished. He'll be finished, Kuwait will be finished, all petrol will be finished, all right. Everybody will be in trouble. But what about him? He won't be there too. Because if the Americans have to fight, they'll go in his place and fight. They won't fight in America. He's not going to go to America to fight them. Few Americans may be dead. So now, in this Saddam's brain also Hanumana is working and telling him, now see, mister, if you do like this, then this will happen. He works into the brains of all the politicians, all these egoistical people. And then they get sometimes stunned, sometimes they change their policies, they come round, and that's how they manage. Also, another great quality of Hanumana is that he makes people sort of an arbitrator. He makes people meet each other, and two egoistical people, he will make them meet, and then he'll create such situation that they both become friends and become mild. So his whole character within us acts us to see our ego, discriminate that, oh, this is my ego that is working, and then to become childlike and sweet, mirthful and happy. He's always in a dancing mood. All the time he's dancing, and before Rama he's always bowed down and always wants to do whatever is the desire of Sri Ram. So if Ganesha stands behind me, Hanumana stands here at my feet. And he's there. In the same way, I would say, if Germany has, he has asked me that if Germany can become like Hanumana, then what a dynamic force we have if they become so subservient. And the subservient nature of Hanumana is seen to such an extent that, as you know the story of Sita when she gave a necklace to him and he wouldn't wear it because inside there was no Ram. Once Sita felt that all the time he is around, and so he is sort of cutting out his privacy, her privacy. So she said, now, you can be there only for one work. You need not do every work. He used to do every work of Sri Ram. He said, for one work you should be there, choose whichever work you want to do. He said, only, you see, I would like to be with Sri Ram, that whenever he sneezes, I should do like this. You see, in India, when we sneeze, we have to do like this with this. Because the sneezing is, you see, to avoid all the negativity to go out. So we do like this if you sneeze. Or if you feel sleepy and you yawn, then also we do like that, mostly. So he said, whenever he'll yawn, you allow me just to, this we call it chutki, I don't know what you call this, chutki. Allow me to do this. Sita said, this is something very little work. You see, this fellow then will be out of sight. So he stood there. So he said, now why are you standing here? I'm waiting for that. So how can I go? And that's how she granted. First she granted, all right, given to you this job. Now she can't take it back because she's granted this job. So he's always there like this, standing just to do this to Sri Ram. So I mean the sweetness of the whole thing is that every time, every minute he is subservient, he is attentive, he is there. Also in Sahaja Yoga, I have relationships with you as a guru, as a mother, and I don't know, unlimited. But still, these two relationships we know of, that I am your mother and I am your guru. Now as a guru, my main concern is that you should learn all about Sahaja Yoga. You should become experts of Sahaja Yoga and you should become yourself the gurus. This is the only concern I have. But for that, complete surrender is required. Islam means surrender. So you have to surrender. If you are surrendered, then only you can learn what is the way you will handle Sahaja Yoga. Now even this surrendering is done by Shri Hanumana. He is the one who teaches you how to surrender or makes you surrender. Because egoistical people don't surrender. Then he puts some sort of hurdles or some sort of miracles or some tricks by which then a disciple surrenders himself to the Guru. Otherwise he is not surrendered. He finds it difficult to surrender. And the force that acts to make him surrender to the Guru is also that of Hanumana. So not that he is only surrendered, but he makes others also to be surrendered. Because because of ego you cannot surrender. So he is the one who fights your ego and he puts it down and makes you surrender. So in his own expression, I would say that what he has shown that there is a very beautiful area of right side. If it is to be perfectly enjoyed, then you should be completely surrendered to your Guru as if you are the servant of that Guru. Whatever you have to do for that Guru, you have to do it. Of course, you must know that your Guru has to give you realization minimum. Otherwise, that's not a Guru. But anybody who has given you the realization, you have to be so surrendered that you should be just like a servant, not to feel shy about it. Like I would have sometimes, I am going by say, I'm going by aeroplane, and sometimes I cannot wear my shoes because they are so swollen up. So normally I would take the shoes in my hands and walk about. But I have seen Sahajogis, they pick up my shoes also and walk with it. And they don't feel shy about it. They just feel so proud that they are carrying my shoes. So one should feel proud that you are doing all these things, that you have a chance to do all these things for your Guru, and that you are surrendering to that Guru. You are absolutely only bothered as to how you can serve the Guru, how you can please the Guru, and how you could be closer to that Guru. It doesn't mean physical closeness, but a kind of a rapport, a kind of an understanding. Even those who are away from me can feel me in their heart. And this is what it is, that we have to get this power from Shri Hanumana. Now he is the one who protects also all the deities. He protects. Now there's a difference between Shri Ganesha and him. The Shri Ganesha gives energy, Shakti. But the one who protects is Shri Hanumana. So you'll find that when Shri Krishna was the chariot of Arjuna, then on top of the chariot was sitting Hanumana, not Shri Ganesh. Hanumana was sitting there, looking after him. Also, in a way, that Sri Rama himself becomes Sri Vishnu, so he has to look after him. He is an angel, as you know, according to Christian, we should say, according to Bible, that he is the angel called Gabriel. Now Gabriel is the one who brought the message, because he is always a messenger to Maria. And surprisingly, the words he used were Immaculata Salve. That's my name. My first name is Nirmala, means Immaculata, and surname is Salve. He said those words to her. And today also I was surprised when it came to giving me a present. They found a tea set and dinner set which is called as Maria. So Maria has to do quite a lot with Hanumana all her life. That means Maria is the Mahalakshmi. Mahalakshmi being the Sita. Sita, then Radha. Hanumana has to be there to serve her. And that is why, you see, sometimes people say, Mother, how did you know? Mother, how did you come to know? Mother, how did you send a message? Mother, how did you work it out? Can you imagine? This is Sri Hanumana's headache. He does it. Anything passes through my mind, he just takes it up and he's done. Because as I told you, that his whole organization is so well planned. All these messages, from where do they get? Many people say, Mother, I just prayed to you. There was a gentleman whose mother was very sick and he went to see her, and she was just going to die with cancer. So he said, I didn't know what to do, so I just prayed to you, Mother, please save my mother. Now, the sincerity of that person, the depth of that person, as a Sahajogi, Hanumana knows. He knows what is the weight of this person is. And immediately you'll be surprised, within 3 days, the woman was going to die, survived, she got all right. He brought her to Bombay and the doctor said she has no cancer. Many things which you call miracles are done by Shri Hanuman. He is the one who is the doer of miracles. He does miracles also to show how stupid you are, how foolish you are, because he is on the right side. See, he goes to the ego side. Now with the ego, the human being is always become stupid. And that's, inevitable. With ego, they become so stupid, oh, what's wrong? And that's why you will find many people doing such stupid things, we can't understand why they do it. They say, what's wrong? What's wrong is that Hanumana doesn't like it, is the point. And then it recoils. When they act stupidly, it recoils, and then they know that we have done such a big mistake, or it was all stupid. But sometimes it could be extremely, extremely difficult to retrace back, like the diseases, as I called it, the Yuppies disease, which is now impossible because Hanumana has taken away the electromagnetic force from these people and it doesn't work, it doesn't relate to your conscious mind. So your conscious mind cannot act, it just goes off. Only these people, if they worship Hanumana with the same devotion, then maybe they might be saved. But it's not an easy thing to convince these stupid Yuppies, you see, about anything. They say, we don't believe. So what? So what? You die. What else? That's the only life left for you, and you do that. There are so many aspects of Hanumana which I could have told you. But for example, for his body, you see, like Shiva is covered with geru. What you call geru is that's a kind of you know that geru is a red colored stone which is very, very, it is very hot. And supposing with the cold, sometimes you develop those rashes. So if you put geru, those rashes are covered. Or you get, due to badha sometimes, some sort of skin diseases which are cured with geru. Because it is the one which is very hot and it suits you. On the contrary, Sri Ganesha is covered with lead oxide, with a red lead oxide, which is extremely cold. Lead oxide is a very cool thing. If you touch lead, you see the very cool thing. So that lead oxide is used to cover all his body. To balance the heat that he has or the effects of heat he has. So we call it in Sanskrit language is called as sindura, and also in Marathi or Hindi called shindura. So you must find always this is the color of that thing. So luckily I got this sari in Vienna and I have it very nice for this occasion. So he is always covered with that color, what we call this sindoor color. And lead oxide, though, they say causes cancer. People say that lead oxide can cause you cancer. But it is the lead oxide which is very cool. It can cool you down so much that you can go to the left side. And cancer is a psychosomatic disease, and that might be the reason it might cause, in a very far-fetched way, we can say can cause cancer to you. Because if it is too cold and all that, and then you go to the left side, and the left side you can catch the viruses by which you can get into troubles. So, but the same lead oxide is all right for people who are very right-sided. For them, if it is put on their agya, it cools them down. They are cooled down. And it's very good for them to put on their agya so that they are cooled down. Their anger goes down, their temper goes down, and it's a very good thing. So he is the one who cures our anger. He is the one who cures our hastiness, our speediness, our aggressiveness. He is the one who does it. Now he played a trick on Hitler. How? Hitler was using Sri Ganesha as a symbol. So this swastika was made in a clockwise manner. Then Hanumana played a trick on him. What he did, he made the stencil which they were using for making the, making the swastika. He put it some or other, lot of, he made it in such a way that they said we should use the other side. As soon as they used the other side, it's Hanumana's trick. I suggested to him, but he played the trick. They started using Ganesha from the other side. The same Ganesha about whom Shri Hanumana was worried, how can he surpass Shri Ganesha? Because he is the eldest, and how can you go beyond him? And he is the deity. But Hanumana is an angel. So, as soon as the trick was played, then both of them put together stopped Hitler from winning. This is how the trick was played. So all these little tricks, you see, are there. Once I remember I had my puja in Germany. And Germany is the place where these tricks are played very much by Hanumana, because I told you that they are the ones who require him the most. So there was a Germany, there was a puja, and in the puja, by mistake they put it the other way down, by mistake. I didn't see, I always watch very carefully, but I don't know why that day I didn't see it. It must be also Hanumana's trick. And when I saw, I said, oh God, where is it going to now hurt? Where is it going to work out? Which country it is going to hit? It did not hit Germany, it hit England. Because England, I've worked so hard there, and they have been so negligent about Sahaja Yoga, so lethargic about it, that it just went and hit there. So he is the one who goes like a torrential rain, or can go like a very speedy tempest and destroy things. So he works out all these things through his electromagnetic forces. So all the matter is under his control. All the matter is under his control. And he's the one who creates rain for you, who creates sun for you, he creates breeze for you. He's the one who does all these things just to have a proper puja, to have a proper meeting. Everything he works out so beautifully, and nobody even knows that it is Shri Hanumana who has done it, and we should thank Shri Hanumana all the time. For the today's thing, if I have to talk about him, I'll take hours together, but only thing I have to say that it's such a blessing I feel that we have this in this palace, Shri Hanumana's Puja, because he was always a very majestic deity or an angel, and that in a place where it is so majestic and beautifully done, everything is there, and he would like that. He is not a sannyasi type of a person. He is not an ascetic. Normally right-sided people are ascetic. They become Bauhaus, they will make. Right-sided people, they will have everything simple. They would like to shave off their nose also if possible on the faces. So, you see, the other way around, Hanumana is not. Hanumana likes beauty, he likes decorativeness, and he makes people non-ascetic. So, Hanumana gives you this kind of thing. But many people who are worshippers of Hanumana always say that those ladies should never go and take the darshan of Hanuman because Hanumana is a brahmachari. Is the one who doesn't want women to see him, because he doesn't wear full clothes and he has very little clothes on himself, so he doesn't want women to see him. But if women think he's just a child, then it's just the same. But this idea, I think the people don't have, that he's a child. What is for a child? How many clothes he wears or doesn't wear? And then he's a monkey. The monkeys are not supposed to wear clothes. So whatever he wears is quite a lot. And it doesn't give you even the feeling at all that he's in any way nude or anything. But you just see such a sweet form of him. Such a sweet form. I wish sometimes you get his photograph also, as you have got the photographs of Shri Ganesha. Then you will really fall in love with it. It's such a sweet thing. And though he is so huge and so big, and though he has nails, but when he caresses my feet, he pulls back his nails. He is so gentle, extremely gentle, and very beautifully he caresses my feet. And I have seen him the way he handles everything in extremely gentle ways. So that's what I feel, that now Germans are becoming very gentle in handling things, in handling people. This change is coming, and I think is the blessing of Hanumana on them. So may God bless you.